150,000 Americans are standing on the front row of the most powerful storm on the planet this weekend, and most of the country does not even know their names. East of Guam, a typhoon called Bavi is rapidly intensifying toward the top of the scale, and the small islands of the Marianas, American soil, are directly in its path on the 4th of July weekend of all weekends. This is not an ordinary storm, and the reason it's far worse than a typical typhoon is not in the sky at all. It is hidden beneath the waves, in an ocean running hotter than its own normal, quietly handing this storm the power to become one of the most powerful things on Earth, faster than anyone can be warned. I'm going to take you under the surface to show you exactly what is fueling this monster, back through the storms these islands have already survived, and forward to the question that should worry all of us. If you believe these communities deserve to be seen, subscribe to the Sky Lab and stand with me on this one. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether you have ever ridden out a storm like this. Now, let us get into it. Part 1. The warning. No one on the mainland will hear. Right now, a few hundred miles east of a small American island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the sky's doing something that the people who study storms for a living describe with a single, careful word. That word is rapid. Not strong, not dangerous, not historic. Rapid. Because the thing that has forecasters leaning toward their screens this morning is not only how powerful this storm is about to become, it is how fast it is getting there. The storm has a name. It is called Bavi, and in the shorthand of the agencies that track these systems, it carries the label 09W, meaning it is the 9th numbered tropical system of the season in the Western Pacific. That label sounds bureaucratic, almost boring, and that is exactly the problem. Because behind that flat little code is a warning that went out this morning from the National Weather Service office in Tian on the island of Guam, and the warning does not read like paperwork. It reads like a countdown. The office issued a typhoon watch for Guam, for Rota, for Tinian, and for Saipan. Then, as the picture sharpened, they added a tropical storm watch for the smaller northern islands, for Alamagan, for Pagan, and for Agrahan. And in the plain language of the local statement, they wrote the sentence that gives this whole thing its shape. Typhoon Bavi is intensifying rapidly east of Guam. Now, I want you to sit with the numbers attached to that watch, because they are not ordinary numbers. Forecasters are calling for winds near 150 knots, with gusts to 180 knots. If those words do not mean anything to you yet, let me translate them out of the language of ships and into the language of the ground under your feet. 150 knots is roughly 173 miles per hour of sustained wind. The gusts at 180 knots come to around 207 miles per hour, and the seas, the water. This storm is stacking up beneath itself, a forecast to build as high as 45 feet. 45 feet. That is a moving hill of ocean taller than a 4-story building, and it is aimed, right now, at islands where American citizens are waking up, checking the sky, and wondering how much time they actually have. So let me answer that question the way the forecasters answered it, because they were specific. They said typhoon conditions, meaning sustained winds of 64 knots or greater, are possible within the next 48 to 72 hours. That is the window, 2 to 3 days. And in that window, a storm that is already a serious threat is expected to keep climbing, because the ocean it is crossing is handing it fuel faster than it can burn it. Here is the part that I need you to understand before we go any further, because everything else in this story hangs on it. There is a line on the scale we use to measure these storms. On the Saffir-Simpson scale, the one you've heard on the news your whole life, a Category 5 begins at 137 knots of sustained wind, which is about 157 miles per hour. Anything above that line is the top of the scale. There is no Category 6. Category 5 is simply the box we put every monster into, from the ones that are barely over the line to the ones that would tear that line to pieces if we let them. Bavi's forecast, near 150 knots, is not near that line, it is over it, comfortably over it. This is a storm being drawn, in the language of official warnings, into the most powerful category we have a name for, and it is being drawn there quickly, over open water, on a holiday weekend, while most of the country it belongs to is looking the other way. And that phrase, the country it belongs to, is the thing I want to hold on to, because it is the reason this story matters more than a line on a map. Guam is not a foreign place that a storm happens to be threatening. Guam is the United States. It is a territory, home to roughly 150,000 people, American citizens who vote in primaries, who serve in the military at some of the highest rates in the entire country, who send their kids to American schools and shop in American stores, and, this weekend, will be trying to figure out how to protect their homes from a wall of wind that the mainland news may barely mention. Add in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the chain that includes Saipan and Tinian and Rota, and you add tens of thousands more Americans, all of them sitting inside the watch area that went out this morning. I have covered a lot of storms on this channel. I have walked you through heat that broke century-old records, through solar storms that lit up skies where they had no business appearing, through earthquakes that rearranged coastlines. And if you have been here for a while, you know that I try never to manufacture fear, because the data almost never needs my help. The data is alarming enough on its own. This is one of those times. Let me set the scene a little more because context matters here. The Western Pacific is where the biggest storms on Earth are born, and it runs its own season on its own schedule, largely out of view of American news. Storms there are given names from a rotating international list, contributed by the many nations that ring that ocean, which is why you get a name like Bavi rather than something that sounds familiar from the Atlantic. And the numbering, that flat little 09W, is simply the count of significant systems the forecasters have tracked in that basin this season. Bavi is the 9th. What that number quietly tells you is that this ocean has already been busy, and that the machinery that makes these storms is fully awake and running. And that machinery is running at a particular moment. We are early in the Western Pacific's most active stretch of the year, over water that, as we will get to, is primed in a way that should make anyone who studies these storms pay close attention. A powerful, rapidly intensifying typhoon at this point in the calendar, over this particular reservoir of ocean heat, is not business as usual. It is the basin showing its hand early and showing it strong. If you have followed our recent coverage, you will remember that this is not the first time this season the Western Pacific has produced a storm that made forecasters sit up. It keeps happening, and it keeps happening for a reason that lives beneath the surface of the sea. I also want to be honest about why this particular storm, out of everything crossing my desk this morning, is the one I chose to bring you. There is a lot competing for attention in the sky this weekend, and some of it is genuinely dramatic. But Bavi is the story where the stakes are highest, and the human beings are most directly and immediately in harm's way. It is the story where a real American community is about to meet the most powerful thing on the planet, with a shrinking window to prepare. When you weigh the whole sky, that is the one that rises to the top. So that is where we are going to spend our time. So let me tell you exactly what I mean when I say Bavi is something far worse than a typical typhoon, because the Western Pacific makes a lot of typhoons, and most of them, thankfully, are not this. The Western Pacific is, in fact, the single most active place on Earth for storms like this. It produces more named tropical systems in a normal year than any other ocean basin on the planet. If you live on Guam or Saipan, a typhoon watch is not a novelty, it is a season. These islands have been hardened by generations of storms, built and rebuilt with concrete and rebar precisely because the sky out here has a long memory and a short temper. That is what makes this one different. A typical typhoon is a known quantity. You watch it form, you watch it strengthen over days, you track its slow, predictable march, and you prepare with the time the ocean gives you. What Bavi is doing is collapsing that time. It is compressing days of strengthening into hours, and a storm that explodes instead of grows is a fundamentally different kind of danger, not because the final wind speed is higher, though it may well be, but because the warning that comes with it is shorter. Think of it this way. Imagine two storms that both end up as Category 5s with the same brutal wind speed. One of them took a week to get there, announcing itself the whole way, giving every island in its path a running start. The other one was a modest, unremarkable system just a day or two earlier, the kind of thing you would glance at and set aside, and then it detonated. The final number on both storms is identical, but the second storm will hurt more people, and it will hurt them worse, because it stole their time. It arrived before the fear did. That is the storm we are watching this morning. And I want to be honest with you about something, because intellectual honesty is the whole point of what we do here. As I record this, Bavi is a forecast as much as it is a fact. The 150 knots, the 180 knot gusts, the 45-foot seas, these are what the models and the forecasters expect over the next 2 to 3 days. Storms are living things. Bavi could overperform that forecast and become something even the warnings did not fully capture. It could also stumble, hit a patch of the atmosphere it does not like, and back off. Tracks wobble. Intensity forecasts are among the hardest predictions in all of science. I am not going to stand here and tell you I know exactly where this ends, because nobody does, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling you something. But here is what I can tell you with confidence, and it is the thing that should make you lean in the way the forecasters are leaning in. The National Weather Service does not casually reach for the phrase intensifying rapidly. That is not a mood. That is a technical description of a specific, measurable behaviour, and it is the behaviour that has produced almost every one of the truly catastrophic tropical storms of the modern era. When the professionals put that phrase in a public warning, they are telling you that the ordinary rules of preparation, the ones built on the assumption that you will have days, may not apply this time. And so the question that will run underneath everything we talk about today, the question I want you to carry with you as we go, is not really how strong will Bavi get. That is a number, and we will chase it. The deeper question, the one that should keep you here, is this. What is it about that particular stretch of ocean, east of Guam, on this particular weekend, that can take a storm the sky produces by the dozens and turn it, in a matter of hours, into one of the most powerful things on the entire planet? What is down there in the water feeding this thing? Because once you understand that, you will understand why the word the forecasters keep using is rapid. And you will understand why, of everything happening in the sky this weekend, this is the story I could not let pass. Let us start with the storm itself, and then we will go looking for what is underneath it. Part 2. The word that changes everything. There is a phrase in the world of hurricane science that sounds technical and harmless, and it is neither. The phrase is rapid intensification, and meteorologists use it so often that it has its own two-letter shorthand RE. But do not let the tidy abbreviation fool you. When you strip away the jargon, rapid intensification is the single most frightening thing a storm can do. And it is the exact thing that Bavi is doing right now. So let me define it precisely, because precision matters here. The United States National Hurricane Center draws a specific line. A storm is said to be rapidly intensifying when its maximum sustained winds increase by at least 30 knots, which is about 35 miles per hour, in a single 24-hour period. That is the official threshold. 35 miles per hour of new wind added in one day. Now, that may not sound like much when you say it out loud. 35 miles per hour is a speed you would drive through a neighbourhood, but we're not talking about the storm's forward motion. We're talking about the wind inside its wall, the wind that snaps steel and peels roofs, gaining 35 miles per hour of raw strength between one sunrise and the next. And here is the thing about Bavi. To be described the way it is being described, a system climbing toward 150 knots, in the kind of window forecasters are watching, it is not merely crossing that 30-knot threshold. It is blowing past it. To understand why that is so dangerous, you have to understand what is actually happening inside the storm when it does this. A tropical cyclone is, at its core, a machine for moving heat. Warm, moist air rises off the surface of the ocean. As it rises, it cools, the water vapour inside it condenses into cloud and rain, and that condensation releases an enormous amount of energy, the same energy the sun poured into the ocean to evaporate that water in the first place. That released heat warms the air around it, making it rise faster, which pulls in more warm air from below, which rises and releases more heat. It is a loop that feeds itself. Meteorologists have a name for it. They call it the heat engine. Most of the time, that engine runs at a steady, inefficient idle. Something is holding it back. Maybe the winds high in the atmosphere are blowing in a different direction from the winds near the surface, tearing at the storm structure, a force we call wind shear. Maybe there is dry air getting sucked into the core, choking the rising columns of moisture. Maybe the storm is simply disorganized, its energy scattered across a wide, messy field of thunderstorms with no clear center. As long as any of those brakes are on, the storm grumbles along, strong perhaps, but held in check. Rapid intensification is what happens when all the brakes come off at once. The wind shear relaxes, the dry air stays away. The storm's own thunderstorms begin to organize, wrapping into tighter and tighter bands around a common center, and then, at the moment that separates a bad storm from a nightmare, an eye forms. A clear, calm, cloudless column punches down through the middle of the system, and around it the winds tighten and accelerate the way a spinning skater speeds up when she pulls her arms in. Once that eye locks in over water that is warm enough and reaches far enough below the surface, the heat engine stops idling and opens up to full throttle. And a storm at full throttle can gain strength at a rate that outruns every human system built to warn people about it. That is the process. Now let me show you why it terrifies the professionals, using storms whose names you may remember. There was a storm in the Eastern Pacific in 2015 that went from a tropical storm to the most powerful hurricane ever measured in the Western Hemisphere in a little over a day, its winds spiking past 200 miles per hour. There was a hurricane that struck the Florida Panhandle in 2018 that was still strengthening at the very moment it crossed the coastline, catching communities that had prepared for a lesser storm. There was a hurricane off the coast of Mexico just a couple of years ago that exploded from a modest tropical storm into a catastrophic Category 5 in a single afternoon and evening, giving the city and its path almost no time to grasp what was coming before it arrived. In every one of those cases, the horror was not only the final wind speed, the horror was the speed of the change. The storms became monsters faster than the warnings could keep up. There is one more piece of the intensification story I want to give you, because it explains why forecasting the final strength is even harder than it sounds, and it has a name that sounds almost gentle. It is called the eye wall replacement cycle. Here is what happens. As a storm reaches great strength, the ring of thunderstorms around its eye, the eye wall, can become so intense that a second ring begins to form around it, a larger circle outside the first. For a while, the two rings compete for the same fuel, and the outer one slowly strangles the inner one. During that process, the storm actually weakens a little, and its eye grows wider. And then, once the outer ring takes over completely and contracts, the storm often re-intensifies, sometimes back to its former strength or beyond, but now larger, its damaging winds spread across a wider area than before. So a storm can pulse, strong, then briefly less strong, then strong again and bigger, and each of those swings is another thing the forecast has to try to capture in a system that is changing by the hour. When you hear that a storm's intensity is difficult to predict, this is part of what that means. It is not one climb. It is a series of climbs and pauses and reclimbs, each one hard to time, and here is the human tragedy folded inside all of that complexity. People do not prepare for a storm in the abstract. They prepare for the specific storm they were told is coming. If the forecast on the day you board your window says strong typhoon, that is the storm you brace for, mentally and materially. You buy the supplies that match that storm. You make the decisions, stay or go, that match that storm. And if the ocean then hands that storm a burst of rapid intensification in the final day, you do not get a do-over. You have already committed your preparations to a lesser storm, and the greater one arrives to meet them. That mismatch between the storm people prepared for and the storm that actually shows up is where rapid intensification does its cruelest work. It does not just make a storm stronger, it makes people wrong, through no fault of their own, at the worst possible moment. And if you have been watching this channel closely, you have seen this exact pattern before, more than once, in the last few weeks. About 10 days ago, we sat down and worked through a typhoon that had become the strongest storm the Western Pacific had produced in that month in more than 2 decades, a system that underwent its own explosive spin-up over warm water and low shear. Back in the spring, across a run of videos, we followed a Category 5 that took aim at American soil and made landfall on these very same Mariana Islands. And in the video we did on Tropical Storm Arthur, the whole story was about a system doing something the textbook said it should not have been able to do at that time and in that place. I'm telling you this not to repeat myself, but because the pattern keeps knocking on the same door. The ocean out here keeps producing these explosive storms, and each time, the word the forecasters reach for is the same: rapid. So the natural question is, why now? Why does the atmosphere let the brakes off for one storm and keep them on for another? Part of the answer is luck, honestly. The random alignment of wind shear and moisture that no forecaster can perfectly predict, more than a day or two out. That is why intensity forecasting remains one of the hardest problems in the whole field of atmospheric science. We have gotten remarkably good at predicting where a storm will go. We are still humbled, again and again, by how strong it will get. But the other part of the answer, the part that is not luck, is the part that should hold your attention. Because while wind shear and moisture decide whether the engine can run, there is something else that decides how powerful the engine is allowed to become, and that something is not in the sky at all. It is in the water. It is the fuel in the tank, and the tank beneath Bavi, in that particular corner of the Western Pacific east of Guam, is not just full. It is the largest, warmest reservoir of storm fuel anywhere on the face of the Earth. I keep coming back to that image of the countdown, the 2 to 3 day window in the warning, and here is why it matters so much in light of everything I just told you. If Bavi were strengthening slowly, that window would be a comfort. Days to board up, days to move, days to stage supplies and open shelters. But a storm in rapid intensification does not respect the window. It can arrive at the top of its strength early, or hold that strength longer, or find one more burst of fuel at the worst possible moment. The window tells you when the winds arrive. It does not tell you how much bigger the thing on the other end will be by the time they do. So before we can say anything honest about how bad this gets for Guam and the Marianas, we have to go where the forecasters go when they want to know a storm's ceiling. We have to stop looking at the clouds and start looking beneath the waves. Because whatever is down there is what will decide whether Bavi tops out as a severe but survivable typhoon, or whether it keeps climbing into something the scale we use can barely contain. Let me take you under the surface. Part 3. The fuel beneath the waves. Everyone knows that hurricanes and typhoons feed on warm ocean water. You've heard it 100 times on the news. Warm water, big storm. It is true, but it is only the first inch of the truth, and the rest of the truth is exactly what separates an ordinary typhoon from the thing Bavi is becoming. Here is the mistake almost everyone makes. When we talk about warm ocean water, we picture the surface, the top skin of the sea, the temperature you would feel if you dipped your hand off the side of a boat. And the sea surface temperature does matter. A storm needs that surface to be warm, generally above about 26 degrees Celsius, which is around 79 degrees Fahrenheit, before it can really get going. But the surface temperature is not the fuel gauge. It is only the reading on the very top of the tank, and a storm does not sip from the top of the tank, it drinks from the whole thing. Let me explain why, because this is the idea that unlocks the entire story. When a powerful storm sits over the ocean, its winds do not just skim across the surface, they churn it. They drag up water from below and mix the top layers of the sea like a spoon in a cup. Now, imagine the warm surface water is only a thin film, and just beneath it sits a layer of cold water. As the storm churns, it pulls that cold water up to the surface, and cold water is poison to a hurricane. The storm chokes on its own upwelling, it stirs up the very thing that kills it, and it weakens. But now imagine the opposite. Imagine the warmth does not stop at the surface. Imagine it runs down through the water column, a thick layer of warm water reaching far below the waves, so that no matter how hard the storm churns, everything it drags up is still warm. The cold water is too far down to reach. In that situation, the storm never chokes. Every mouthful it takes is fuel, the engine never stalls, and that is the exact condition that allows rapid intensification to run wild. Scientists have a way of measuring this. They do not just look at the surface temperature. They look for the depth of what they call the 26-degree isotherm, which is a fancy way of saying, how far down do you have to go before the water finally cools below that critical 26 degrees Celsius mark? If that warm layer is shallow, only a few dozen feet, a storm will churn through it quickly and stall. If that warm layer runs down hundreds of feet, the storm has a bottomless tank. They roll all of this together into a single value called tropical cyclone heat potential, and when forecasters see high heat potential ahead of a storm, they brace themselves, because high heat potential is the runway that rapid intensification needs. Now let me tell you about the specific patch of ocean that Bavi is crossing, east of Guam, because it is not just any patch of ocean. That region sits on the edge of what oceanographers call the Western Pacific Warm Pool, and the warm pool is not a metaphor. It is the largest reservoir of warm water anywhere on planet Earth. It is a body of ocean where the warmth does not stop at the surface, but reaches far down into the water column, a standing tank of stored solar energy the size of a continent. It is, quite simply, the best place on the entire planet for a storm to become a monster. If you wanted to design a laboratory for building the most powerful typhoons imaginable, you could not do better than the water east of Guam. Nature already built it. Let me make the mechanics of that reservoir even more concrete, because I think the picture of exactly how a storm and the ocean interact is the thing that makes all of this click. Under normal conditions, the ocean is layered like a cake. There is a warm layer on top, heated by the sun, and then a boundary where the temperature drops off quickly with depth, which oceanographers call the thermocline, and below that the cold, dark water that makes up most of the sea. In most parts of the ocean, that warm top layer is fairly thin, and the cold water sits close beneath the surface waiting. A strong storm passing over that kind of water acts like a mixer set on high. Its winds drive the surface water in circles, and that churning reaches down, grabs the cold water below the thermocline, and hauls it up to the top. Within hours, the storm has replaced the bathwater it was sitting in with cold water it dredged up itself, and it starts to weaken. The storm, in effect, digs its own grave. Now here is what makes the Western Pacific warm pool the exception that produces monsters. In that reservoir, the warm layer is not thin. The thermocline is pushed far down, so the warm water runs well beneath the reach of the storm's churning. When Bavi mixes the ocean beneath it, there is no cold water within reach to pull up. Everything it stirs is warm. The mixer runs, and the bathwater never cools. That is the difference between a storm that stalls and a storm that keeps climbing, and it is entirely a matter of what is waiting a few hundred feet below the surface. The surface temperature you would feel with your hand might look identical over two different patches of ocean, but one of them has cold water lurking just beneath, and the other, the warm pool, has a tank that goes down and down. From the outside they look the same. To a storm they are the difference between life and death. There is even a subtler wrinkle to this that oceanographers have studied, involving the saltiness of the water. In parts of the tropical Western Pacific, heavy rainfall and river runoff create a layer of fresher water floating on top of the saltier ocean beneath. Fresh water is lighter than salt water, so this creates what scientists call a barrier layer, a lid that makes the ocean even harder to mix. It further protects the warm surface water from the cold below, because the storm's churning struggles to punch through the density difference. In other words, the very region Bavi is crossing may be doubly insulated against the one process that normally weakens storms. The cold water is both too far down and too well sealed off to come to the rescue. Everything about this stretch of ocean is arranged, by pure accident of geography and climate, to let a storm burn as hot as it possibly can for as long as it possibly can. And this is the picture I really want you to hold, because it reframes what a typhoon even is. We tend to think of a storm as a thing in the sky, a swirl of cloud and wind that appears and moves and dissipates. But a storm is better understood as a wound in the ocean, a place where the sea is bleeding its stored heat up into the atmosphere as fast as physics allows. The clouds and the wind are just what that heat looks like on its way out, and the size of the wound, the amount of heat the sea is willing to give up, is set entirely by the reservoir below. Over a thin, warm layer, the wound is shallow and heals quickly. Over the warm pool east of Guam, the wound goes as far down as the storm can reach, and it does not heal, and the heat keeps pouring out, and the wind keeps climbing. That is Bavi. That is what the word rapid is describing. It is the sound of the largest heat reservoir on Earth being opened all at once, and this is where I have to connect a thread we have been pulling on for weeks on this channel, because it matters right now, tonight, under Bavi. The Pacific Ocean is running warm, not just at the surface, but through that reservoir. The official measure of the Pacific's temperature state, the index that tracks whether we are sliding toward El Niño or La Niña, currently sits at plus 0.48. In plain terms, that means the Pacific is in a neutral state, but it is warming, climbing steadily out of a cool phase it was in just months ago. The key stretch of the tropical Pacific is running at around 28 degrees Celsius, and the trend over the past half year has been a relentless march upward, from cool to neutral to warm and climbing. We covered this exact shift in our recent videos on the Pacific smashing heat records and on El Niño building on a warmed baseline. At the time, we were mostly talking about what a warming Pacific means for droughts, for heat waves, for the long arc of the seasons. But there is a more immediate consequence, and it is floating right there beneath this storm. A warmer Pacific means a deeper, hotter reservoir of storm fuel. It means the tank is not just full, it is overfull. And when a system like Bavi wanders into it with low wind shear and an eye starting to form, that overfull tank is exactly what lets the heat engine open all the way up and stay there. Let me put a number on the scale of energy we're talking about, because I think people underestimate it by orders of magnitude. A single mature tropical cyclone running at full strength releases heat energy at a rate that dwarfs human civilization. Depending on how you measure it, the energy a large storm releases through cloud and rain formation in a single day is on the order of hundreds of times the entire electrical generating capacity of the whole world. Not one country. The whole world, every power plant, every dam, every reactor combined, and the storm is putting out hundreds of times that, continuously, for days. And it is doing it by pulling stored heat out of that reservoir beneath it. The storm is not creating energy. It is a straw in a very, very large glass, and the glass east of Guam is the biggest one on the planet. Once you see it that way, the word rapid stops being a surprise and starts being almost inevitable. Of course, a storm over the Western Pacific warm pool with the brakes off would intensify explosively. It is sitting on top of more available fuel than any storm anywhere else on Earth could dream of. The only real question is how much of that fuel it manages to convert into wind before it reaches the islands, and that is a question of hours and of luck. I want to pause here and be careful, because this is the point where speculation can run ahead of the science, and I promised you I would not let it. We do not know Bavi's final strength. The warm pool sets a ceiling, a maximum possible intensity, but not every storm reaches its ceiling. Wind shear could return, dry air could intrude, the storm could pass over a patch it churned itself and briefly starve. All of those are real possibilities, and any one of them could keep Bavi below the worst-case number. The presence of enormous fuel does not guarantee a catastrophe. It only makes one possible, and it removes the single biggest natural brake that usually keeps these storms in check. When the fuel is unlimited, the storm's fate comes down to the sky, not the sea, and the sky, right now, is cooperating with the storm. So here is the thread I want you to hold as we climb back up out of the water. The reason forecasters keep saying Bavi is intensifying rapidly is not mysterious once you understand what is beneath it. It is rapid because it is crossing the richest fuel supply on the planet at a moment when that fuel supply is running hotter than its own recent normal. The ocean is the reason. The same ocean that gives these islands their beaches and their fisheries and their turquoise water is, this weekend, quietly handing a storm the power to erase parts of them. That is the trade the warm pool is making right now, out of sight, below the surface. And it raises a question that goes beyond this one storm. If the fuel is only getting deeper and hotter, then how high is the ceiling actually rising? And are storms like Bavi the exception, or are they becoming the rule? That is where we go next. Part 4. The ceiling nobody wants to talk about. There is a concept in atmospheric physics that I find genuinely unsettling, and it is the natural next step from everything we just talked about. It is the idea that every storm, over every patch of ocean, has a speed limit, a theoretical maximum, given the temperature of the water, the temperature of the upper atmosphere, and the physics of how heat moves between them. There is a ceiling on how strong a storm in that spot is physically allowed to become. The atmospheric scientist most associated with this idea, Kerry Emanuel, called it the maximum potential intensity, and the phrase tells you exactly what it is. It is the most a storm could possibly be if everything went its way. Now here is why that idea matters for Bavi, and why it should matter to you well beyond this weekend. The maximum potential intensity is not a fixed number carved into the sky. It moves, and the single biggest thing that moves it is the temperature of the ocean underneath. Warm the water, and you raise the ceiling. Raise the ceiling, and you give storms permission to become things they simply could not have become over cooler seas. You're not making every storm stronger. You're raising the roof on how strong the worst ones are allowed to get. Think of it like a stadium with a retractable roof. Most days the roof is high enough that nobody ever touches it. The storms that form are ordinary and they top out well below the ceiling, brought down by wind shear or dry air long before they reach it. But every so often a storm gets everything it wants. The brakes come off, the eye forms, the fuel is unlimited, and that storm sprints straight up toward the roof. And if you have quietly raised the roof by warming the ocean, that sprinting storm now has more room to climb before it hits the top. The rare storm that reaches its ceiling becomes more dangerous, not because storms in general got worse, but because the worst ones now have permission to go higher. And this is not just theory anymore. Over the past decade or so, scientists have gone back through the records, and they have found something that lines up uncomfortably well with the physics. Research published in major journals has argued that the rate of rapid intensification, the odds that a given storm will explode in strength the way Bavi is exploding, has been climbing as the upper ocean has warmed. The storms are not just getting a little stronger on average. The specific terrifying behavior, the sudden spin-up, appears to be happening more often and more intensely than it used to. The thing that gives forecasters the least warning is the thing that seems to be on the rise. Let me explain why that makes physical sense so it does not sound like just a scary statistic. Rapid intensification is a threshold behavior. It only happens when a storm crosses from a state where the brakes are on into a state where they come off and the engine can run free over sufficient fuel. Now, if you slowly raise the amount of fuel available everywhere, by warming and deepening the ocean's warm layer across the whole basin, you do two things at once. You make it easier for any given storm to cross that threshold, and you raise how high it can climb once it does. It is like lowering the bar a runner has to clear while also lengthening the track on the other side. More storms make the jump, and the ones that do run farther. That is exactly the fingerprint the research is finding, and it is exactly what you would predict from the simple physics of a warmer sea. There is a detail here that I find quietly haunting, and it is about where all of that extra heat has actually been going. When people talk about a warming world, they usually picture the air getting hotter. But the atmosphere is a lightweight thing. The overwhelming majority of the extra heat that has been trapped over the past several decades has not gone into the air at all. It has gone into the ocean. The sea has been absorbing that heat quietly, year after year, storing it in exactly the reservoirs that storms feed on. So when you stand on a beach and the water feels a little warmer than you remember from childhood, you're not imagining it, and you're not feeling something trivial. You're feeling the fuel supply for the next generation of storms being topped off in real time. The warm pool east of Guam is where a great deal of that stored heat lives, and Bavi is what it looks like when a storm cashes some of it in. None of this means Bavi itself was caused by any single thing, and I want to keep that line clean. You cannot point at one storm and say this exact typhoon exists because of a warming ocean, any more than you can point at one hot afternoon and blame it entirely on the long-term trend. Weather is always a roll of the dice, but a warming ocean is a loaded die. It does not decide any single roll, but it shifts the odds again and again toward the higher numbers, toward the explosive spin-ups, toward the storms that reach the top of the scale in a day, and over enough rolls, loaded dice show their weight. Bavi is one roll, the trend is the weight behind it, and the weight right now is being added to the tank beneath this storm faster than at almost any time in the record. I want to be measured here, because this is the kind of claim that gets stretched in both directions. There are people who will tell you every storm is now a climate monster, and that is not true, and it is not what the science says. Most storms are still ordinary. The number of storms that form each year has not simply skyrocketed. But the tail of the distribution, the rare, explosive, record-setting end of it, is where the change shows up. And that is precisely the end of the distribution that Bavi is living in right now. When we talk about a storm crossing the warm pool and rapidly intensifying toward the top of the scale, we are not talking about an average storm. We are talking about exactly the kind of event where a warming ocean shows its hand. Let me connect this to the number I mentioned earlier, the Ocean State Index sitting at plus 0.48 and climbing. That warming is not just a statistic in a climate report. It is the roof of the stadium being cranked upward in real time. It is the 26-degree warm layer reaching a little farther down than it used to. It is the maximum potential intensity over the Western Pacific creeping higher, quietly, season after season. And a storm like Bavi is what it looks like when a system finally takes advantage of that raised ceiling. There is a human cost buried in this physics, and it is not the cost you might expect. The most important thing a warming ocean steals is not property, it is time. Because a storm that can rapidly intensify to a higher ceiling is a storm that can go from manageable to catastrophic in a shorter window, and a shorter window means less warning. Every hour of warning is worth lives. It is the hour a family uses to board the windows, to fill the bathtub, to get grandma to the shelter, to decide whether to ride it out or run. Rapid intensification eats those hours, and if the ocean keeps making rapid intensification more common, then the future it is quietly building is not just one of stronger storms, it is one of shorter warnings. It is a world where the sea can build a monster faster than we can sound the alarm. That is the thread that runs straight back to Bavi. Everything about this storm, the word rapid, the climb past the Category 5 line, the 48 to 72-hour window, is a preview of that world. The ocean east of Guam is doing, this weekend, exactly what the physics says a warming ocean will do more and more often. It is taking an ordinary storm and, using nothing but stored heat, turning it into one of the most powerful things on the planet, and it is doing it fast enough to shrink the warning for everyone in its path. So let us stop talking about ceilings and reservoirs in the abstract, and let us go stand for a moment on the ground those winds are aimed at. Let me show you what 150 knots actually does when it stops being a forecast and starts being a Tuesday. Part 5. What 150 knots does. We throw wind speeds around so casually that they lose their meaning. 150 knots, 180 knot gusts. They are just numbers on a graphic coloured bands on a map. So I want to slow down and make them real, because the difference between a strong storm and a catastrophic one is not what most people think, and the math behind it is genuinely alarming. Here is the thing nobody tells you about wind. The force it exerts does not grow in a straight line with its speed. It grows with the square of its speed. That means if you double the wind speed, you do not double the force it pushes with. You quadruple it, and that single fact changes everything about how you should think about a storm like Bavi. Let me walk it through. A strong, healthy tropical storm might have winds of around 60 miles per hour. Unpleasant, but survivable in a decent building. Now take Bavi's forecast sustained winds, near 173 miles per hour. That is not 3 times as fast as our 60 mile per hour storm. It is a little under 3 times as fast. But because force grows with the square of speed, the push against a wall, against a roof, against a person caught outside, is not 3 times greater. It is more than 8 times greater, and the gusts near 207 miles per hour push with something like 12 times the force of that ordinary storm. The wind is not a little worse. It is in an entirely different world, a world where the ordinary rules of what buildings survive and what people can withstand stop applying. At those speeds, wind stops behaving like air and starts behaving like a solid thing. It does not push on a structure, it hammers it. Roofs do not blow off in one piece so much as they are pried apart, panel by panel, as the pressure finds every seam and every weakness and works it like a crowbar. Windows do not simply break, they implode, and once one fails, the wind gets inside, and a house with the wind inside it can be lifted and torn from within, the way you would burst a paper bag by blowing into it. Anything not bolted to the earth becomes a projectile. A sheet of plywood, a road sign, a section of someone's fence at 200 miles per hour becomes a blade moving faster than a car on a highway. And I have not even gotten to the water yet, which in most of these storms is the part that actually kills the most people. Wind is terrifying, but wind is survivable if you're in the right building. Water is a different negotiation entirely. Bavi's forecast calls for seas building as high as 45 feet. Let me make sure that lands. 45 feet of ocean is a moving mountain of water higher than a 4-story building, and it does not arrive as a single clean wave you can watch coming. It arrives as chaos, as a churning, debris-filled surge that rises and rises with no clear top, driven forward by the storm's winds and pulled upward by its low pressure. When that meets an island, it does not lap at the shore. It reaches inland, and it takes with it everything that is not anchored to bedrock. Cars, boats, the walls of buildings, the contents of homes, and when people misjudge it, people. For an island, this water threat carries a cruelty that mainland communities do not fully face. When a hurricane threatens the coast of a continent, people can move inland, away from the water, to higher and safer ground dozens or hundreds of miles from the sea. On an island like Guam or Saipan, there is no inland. There is no 100 miles away. The whole of the land is coast. Everyone is, in some sense, on the front row. You cannot outrun the water by driving west, because 30 minutes of driving puts you back at the ocean on the other side. The geography that makes these islands beautiful is the same geography that leaves them nowhere to hide. And there is a third danger, one that hides behind the wind and the surge, and often ends up doing quiet, enormous damage of its own, and that is the rain. A storm the size and strength of Bavi carries an almost unbelievable amount of water in the air, and it wrings it out over whatever it crosses. We are talking about the potential for many inches, even feet, of rain falling in a single day on steep island terrain where that water has nowhere to go but down, fast in flash floods and landslides. On a mountainous island, the rivers and the storm drains and the hillsides can only absorb so much before the water takes charge, sweeping down slopes, undercutting roads, burying the low ground. The wind writes the headlines, but on islands like these, it is often the water, in all 3 of its forms, the surge from the sea, the rain from the sky, and the floods that follow, that does the deepest and longest lasting harm. let me also make sure you understand what the aftermath of a storm like this actually looks like. Because the moment the winds die is not the moment the danger ends. It is in many ways the beginning of the hardest part. When a Category 5 passes over a small island, it does not just damage buildings, it takes down the systems that make modern life possible all at once. The power grid goes first, poles snapped, lines torn down, substations flooded. The water system fails because it depends on that power to pump and to treat. Communications collapse, cell towers down, the internet gone, families unable to reach each other or the outside world. Fuel becomes scarce because the stations cannot pump without power, and the resupply ships cannot dock until the port is cleared. Every one of those failures feeds the others. No power means no water means no sanitation. No communications means no coordination. And on an island, you cannot simply drive in trucks of relief from the next state over. Everything has to come by sea or by air, across thousands of miles of ocean, into ports and runways that the storm may have wrecked. That is why the recovery from these storms is measured not in days but in weeks and months. It is why a storm that spares most of the buildings can still upend tens of thousands of lives for a season, as people wait in line for water, cook by generator, and rebuild the invisible web of infrastructure that the wind unwove in a single night. When I tell you Bavi is a threat, I do not only mean the few hours of the storm's passage, I mean the long grinding aftermath that follows, the part that the rest of the country almost never sees because, by the time it unfolds, the cameras have long since moved on to the next thing, and every hour of that aftermath, every week of that recovery, traces straight back to the same source we keep returning to. The strength that breaks the grid and floods the port and tears the roofs is the strength the warm pool handed the storm. The ocean's stored heat does not just build the monster, it writes the length of the recovery too in the same stroke. There is one more feature of these islands worth understanding, because it is both a shield and a warning, and that is the coral reef. Most of these Pacific islands are ringed by reefs, and in ordinary weather, and even in ordinary storms, those reefs are a first line of defense. They break the incoming waves offshore, absorbing and scattering the energy before it reaches the shore, so that the beaches and the villages behind them feel a gentler sea than they otherwise would. For generations, the reef has been a quiet guardian, taking the ocean's punches so the land does not have to. But a reef can only do so much. When the seas build to the heights Bavi is forecast to reach, 45 feet of storm-driven water, the reef is simply overwhelmed. The waves stop breaking harmlessly offshore and start breaking on the land itself, on the roads and the homes and the sea walls, with a force the reef can no longer blunt. And here is the cruel long-term twist. The same warming ocean that is fueling stronger storms is also stressing and killing coral reefs around the world through heat. So the very defense that has protected these islands for millennia is being weakened by the same warming that is strengthening the storms it defends against. The shield is thinning at exactly the moment the sword is sharpening. Think about what that means, laid out plainly. A warmer ocean gives storms more fuel, raising their ceiling and making rapid intensification more likely. That same warmer ocean bleaches and degrades the coral reefs that have historically absorbed those storms' waves. So the islands face a double squeeze, stronger storms hitting weaker natural defences, both driven by the same rising heat in the same water. It is a stark illustration of how these changes do not arrive one at a time, politely, but compound on each other, the threats growing as the protections shrink. And it all traces back to the temperature of the sea, the single variable underneath this entire story. Warm the water, and you strengthen the storm, weaken the reef, deepen the fuel, raise the ceiling, and shorten the warning, all at once. Bavi is not just one storm over one island. It is a snapshot of that entire squeeze, happening in real time over a small piece of American soil. Now, I want to give credit where it is due, because the people of the Marianas are not naive about any of this. These are some of the most storm-experienced communities on the planet. Homes on Guam and Saipan are frequently built of concrete, reinforced with steel, precisely because wood does not survive out here. Building codes have been written and rewritten in the blood and lessons of past storms. Many families have a plan, a designated concrete structure, a set of supplies, a hard-won respect for the sky. If any population on Earth is prepared to take a hit like this, it is this one. That is not a small thing, and it is a real reason for hope that whatever Bavi does, the loss of life can be held far below what the raw numbers might suggest. But preparation has limits, and this is where rapid intensification returns to haunt the story. All of that readiness, the concrete, the codes, the plans, is built around an assumption. The assumption is that you will know, that the warning will come with enough lead time for the plans to be executed, for the supplies to be gathered, for the shelters to open and fill. Rapid intensification attacks that assumption directly. A storm that is a manageable typhoon when you go to bed, and a Category 5 when you wake up has not given your careful plan enough runway. The strongest concrete house in the world does you no good if you're still at the store buying water when the winds arrive, because the storm strengthened faster than the forecast you were acting on. So when I look at Bavi's numbers, the 150 knots, the 180 knot gusts, the 45-foot seas, I am not only seeing the ceiling of what this storm could do, I am seeing a test of whether the warning will keep pace with the water. And that is the whole reason the word rapid keeps me up at night. It is not that the storm is strong. Plenty of storms are strong. It is that the strength and the warning are in a race, and the ocean has its thumb on the scale for the storm. There is a sound to these storms, by the way, that survivors describe in strikingly similar words, no matter where in the world they lived through one. They call it a roar, a freight train, a jet engine that never lifts off and never lands, hour after hour after hour. It is the sound of the heat engine we talked about, running at full throttle, pouring the stored heat of that ocean reservoir into the wind. It is the sound of the warm pool spending itself. And on these islands, if Bavi delivers what the warning fears, tens of thousands of Americans will spend a night or two listening to that sound in the dark, in a concrete room, waiting for a dawn they cannot be certain will come on schedule. Which brings me to the people themselves, because I have been talking about islands and geography and concrete, and it is easy to forget that these are not abstractions on a map. These are American communities, with schools and churches and hospitals and grandparents and kids sitting directly in the path of the most powerful storm on Earth right now. And I would bet that a large share of the mainland does not even know their names. So let me fix that. Let me tell you exactly who is standing in Bavi's path, and why the fact that they are Americans should make this the biggest weather story in the country this weekend, even if it is not being treated as one. Part 6. The Americans. In the path. Guam is a small island, about 30 miles long and, at its narrowest, only a few miles across. It sits in the Western Pacific, closer to Tokyo and Manila than to Honolulu, and far, far from the mainland most Americans picture when they think of home. On that small island live roughly 150,000 people, and every one of them is a United States citizen. They carry American passports. They pay into the same federal systems. Young people from Guam enlist in the United States military at rates that consistently rank among the very highest of anywhere under the American flag, per person, more than almost any state. When we say American soil, we are not stretching the phrase. We mean it exactly. Just to the north of Guam runs the chain called the Northern Mariana Islands, a commonwealth in political union with the United States, and it includes the islands you saw in this morning's watch, Saipan, Tinian and Rota, along with the smaller northern islands under the tropical storm watch, Alamagan, Pagan and Agrahan. Tens of thousands more Americans live across those islands. Add it all up, and you have a population comparable to a mid-sized American city, spread across small specks of land in the open ocean, sitting inside the warning zone for a storm forecast to reach the top of the scale. Now, there is a strategic dimension to Guam that I have to mention, because it is real, and it is part of why the island matters far beyond its size. Guam hosts major United States military installations. It is one of the most important American strategic positions in the entire Pacific, a hub for air and naval power, a place often described in defense circles as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. That significance is a source of pride and of jobs and of identity for many on the island. But it also means that when a storm threatens Guam, it is not only threatening a community, it is threatening infrastructure that the entire country relies on. And, as we will get to, it is also the reason a certain kind of conspiracy theory reliably attaches itself to every storm that comes near. And there is a practical ripple to that strategic role that most people never consider. When a major storm damages the ports, the runways, the fuel storage, and the power supply on an island like Guam, the effects do not stay on the island. They reach outward, into supply chains and logistics and readiness that span the whole Pacific. A storm that knocks out Guam for weeks is not a local inconvenience. It is a disruption that the entire region feels, a reminder that a single small island carries a weight in the modern world far out of proportion to its size. So when I say the whole country should be watching this storm, I do not only mean out of solidarity with fellow citizens, though that alone should be reason enough. I mean that a direct hit on Guam is, in a real and measurable sense, a hit on the whole country's reach across the largest ocean on Earth. The stakes here run from the smallest, most personal scale, a family boarding a window, all the way up to the strategic position of the United States in the Pacific. Rarely does one storm touch so many levels at once. But I keep pulling myself back to the family in the boarded window because that is where this lives. Strip away the strategy and the supply chains and the maps, and what remains is a mother filling water jugs, a father checking the shutters one more time, a grandmother being helped toward the strongest room in the house, children who can feel the adults' worry even if they do not understand the forecast. That is what a typhoon watch means on the ground. That is who is in the path. And they are Americans on the 4th of July weekend facing the most powerful storm on the planet, and the least I can do, the least any of us can do, is refuse to let them face it unseen. But strip away the strategy for a moment, because I do not want the hardware to crowd out the human beings. What matters most this weekend is not the runways and the ships, it is the families. It is the fact that on these islands, right now, people are doing the quiet, frightening arithmetic that every community in a storm's path has to do. How many days of water do we have? Is the generator working? Which building do we go to? Do we have enough for the kids, for the elderly, for the neighbour who cannot move well on her own? That arithmetic is happening in American homes this weekend, on the 4th of July weekend of all weekends, and much of the country will spend that holiday without ever hearing about it. And that brings me to something I think is worth naming, honestly, because it is a real grievance and not a conspiracy. Storms that threaten these Pacific islands routinely receive a small fraction of the national attention that a comparable storm aimed at Florida or the Gulf Coast would command. A Category 5 bearing down on Miami would be wall-to-wall coverage for a week, and it should be. A Category 5 bearing down on Guam, where the people are just as American, often gets a few lines, if that. I am not telling you this because I think someone is hiding it on purpose. I am telling you because attention is itself a resource. Attention brings aid, brings volunteers, brings political will, brings the simple dignity of being seen in your worst hour. When these communities get overlooked, they are not just fighting the storm, they are fighting the quiet sense that the rest of the country has already moved on. That is not a hidden agenda. It is a habit of neglect, and habits can be broken by exactly the thing you're doing right now, which is paying attention. There is a particular cruelty to the timing too. This is the 4th of July weekend, the weekend the country celebrates itself, cooks out, watches fireworks, wraps itself in the flag. And in the middle of all that celebration, some of the most patriotic Americans in the country, the people of Guam and the Marianas, will be boarding up their windows against a storm the celebration barely notices. If you want a single image to hold on to this weekend, hold on to that one. Fireworks over the mainland and plywood going up over the windows on Guam, both under the same flag, on the same night. I also want you to understand something about the people on these islands, because it changes how you should feel about their odds. The Chamorro people, the indigenous people of the Marianas, have lived on these islands for thousands of years, long before any flag flew over them, and in all that time they have shared the islands with the sea and its storms. That is not a community that will be surprised by a typhoon, or paralysed by one. It is a community with generations of hard-earned knowledge about how to read the sky, how to secure a home, how to store food and water, and above all, how to take care of one another when the outside world cannot reach them. When the power fails and the ports close, it is the neighbours who become the emergency service, the extended family that becomes the shelter, the church and the village that become the relief network. There is a culture of mutual care out here that is, honestly, a kind of technology of its own, refined over centuries of living with exactly this threat. I say that not to minimise the danger, because the danger is enormous and real, but to correct an impression that mainland audiences sometimes have of small islands as helpless dots waiting to be wiped away. These are not helpless communities. They are among the most storm-literate, self-reliant and resilient populations under the American flag. And if any people can take a hit like Bavi and hold together through the long recovery that follows, It is them. The tragedy would not be that they are unprepared. It is that they have to be this prepared, this often, and that they so frequently do it without the attention or the help that their fellow citizens on the mainland could reasonably expect in the same situation. Their strength is real. So is the fact that they should not have to lean on it alone. And it is worth remembering that these islands have never had the luxury of treating a typhoon as someone else's problem. There is no evacuating a whole population off an island in a day. There is no calling in help from the county next door. When the storm comes, the community that is there is the community that has to face it, ride it out, and then rebuild it, largely with its own hands, in the days before outside aid can cross the ocean. That reality has forged a kind of preparedness and solidarity that the mainland, for all its resources, rarely has to develop. It is one of the quiet strengths standing between Bavi and a true catastrophe this weekend. I keep returning to the geography because it is the thing that makes the human stakes so sharp. On the mainland, distance is your friend. You can put miles between yourself and the water. On an island, there is no distance to buy. The whole community occupies the front row, and the ocean that is feeding this storm, the warm pool we spent so much time under, wraps entirely around them. The same water that makes these islands habitable and beautiful is the water handing Bavi its strength. That is the trade at the centre of this entire story, and nowhere on Earth is that trade more visible than on a small island in the middle of the warm pool, watching the sea. It depends on turning into the thing it fears. So when the forecasters say Bavi is intensifying rapidly east of Guam, understand that the word Guam in that sentence is not a coordinate. It is 150,000 of your fellow citizens, and tens of thousands more just to the north, standing on the front row of the most powerful storm on the planet, on the birthday weekend of the country they belong to. That is who is in the path. And the reason the history of this place matters so much right now is that these islands have stood in exactly this path before. And the record of what happened when the monster arrived is not comforting. Let me take you back, because the Marianas remember storms the mainland has never heard of, and those storms are the closest thing we have to a map of what Bavi could do. Part 7. The Islands Remember. Ask anyone who grew up on Guam about typhoons, and sooner or later someone will say the name Karen. Typhoon. Karen struck Guam in November of 1962, and it is the storm against which every other storm on the island is still measured, more than 60 years later. Karen came ashore with winds estimated near and above 150 miles per hour, gusts far higher, and it did something that is hard to imagine unless you have seen the photographs. It flattened the island. Estimates from that time suggested that the great majority of the structures on Guam, something on the order of 90% of homes, were destroyed or heavily damaged. A community was very nearly erased in a single night. But here is the part of the Karen story that matters most for this weekend, because it is the reason those concrete houses I keep mentioning even exist. After Karen, Guam did not simply rebuild what had been lost. It rebuilt differently. The island turned away from the light wooden construction that the wind had shredded and toward concrete and steel, toward homes designed to stand in a wind that would level anything else. The building codes of Guam, the reinforced walls, the typhoon shutters, the whole hardened architecture of the island are in a real sense the children of Typhoon Karen. The islands remember, and they built that memory into their walls. That memory is a large part of why I have real hope that even a monster like Bavi will not repeat the death tolls of the distant past. The Marianas learned. They paid in blood to learn it, and they built the lesson into concrete. But learning does not make you invulnerable, and the storms kept coming to prove it. In December of 2002, Typhoon Pongsona struck Guam as the equivalent of a high-end Category 4. Pongsona did not flatten the island the way Karen had, precisely because of those hardened buildings, but it still delivered a devastating blow. It knocked out power across nearly the entire island, and in some places the light stayed off for weeks. It caused damage measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It reminded everyone that even a modernized, hardened Guam could be brought to its knees, not necessarily by the collapse of every building, but by the collapse of the systems that make modern life possible: power, water, communications, fuel. A storm does not have to level your house to change your life for months. It only has to break the invisible web of infrastructure you depend on without ever thinking about it. And then there is the storm that should be at the front of everyone's mind this weekend, because it hit the exact islands now under the tropical storm and typhoon watches, and it hit them at the exact strength Bavi is being forecast to reach. In October of 2018, Super Typhoon Yutu tore across Tinian and Saipan in the northern Mariana Islands as a Category 5. It is remembered as one of the strongest storms ever to strike any territory under the American flag. Yutu did not spare the concrete. It damaged or destroyed a large share of the buildings on Tinian, tossed vehicles, stripped the vegetation from the land, and left the islands in a state of emergency that took an enormous sustained effort to climb out of. People who lived through Yutu described the sound and the pressure in the same terms survivors of the world's worst storms always use: the freight train roar, the feeling that the walls were breathing, the certainty that the night would not end. Yutu is the analogue that keeps my attention, because it is not ancient history, and it is not a different place. It was less than a decade ago, and it was these islands, Saipan and Tinian, the same names printed in this morning's watch. When forecasters talk about Bavi reaching Category 5 strength near the Marianas, they are describing in effect the possibility of a second Yutu, aimed at the same small chain of islands that is still in real ways carrying the scars of the first one. History does not have to repeat exactly. Bavi's track could shift, its final strength could fall short. But the template is right there in living memory, and it is not comforting. What the recovery from Yutu taught, and what it should remind all of us now, is how long the shadow of one of these storms really is. After Yutu, the islands did not bounce back in a week. Families lived for extended periods without reliable power, without reliable water, in damaged homes or in shelters, while crews worked to rebuild an electrical grid that the storm had shredded. Schools were disrupted. Businesses that were the livelihood of families were gutted. The airport and the port, the two lifelines through which every bit of outside help and every replacement part had to arrive, had to be repaired before the real recovery could even begin, because on an island nothing comes overland. Every generator, every case of water, every roll of roofing, every utility pole had to cross the ocean. And the world's attention, which had flickered briefly toward the Marianas during the storm, had almost entirely moved on within days, long before the hardest months of recovery had even started. That is the pattern I most want the mainland to understand this weekend. The danger of a storm like Bavi is not a single dramatic night. It is a long, quiet emergency that unfolds after the cameras leave, measured in the weeks a child goes without school, the months a family cooks by generator, the slow grind of rebuilding a whole community's infrastructure from the outside in. And the communities that go through it tend to go through it largely on their own strength and their own patience, because the distances are so great and the attention so short. When I say I am rooting for these islands, I am not only rooting for them to survive the winds, I am rooting for them to be seen and helped through the long aftermath that the winds leave behind. And every part of that aftermath, every week of that long recovery, was set in motion once again by the same thing that is spinning up Bavi tonight. The strength that Yutu carried ashore, the strength that took the grid and the port and the normal life of those islands for months, was strength the warm ocean had handed it, hour by hour, out over the water, before it ever arrived. The sea builds the monster, and then the islands spend months answering for what the sea did in a single night. That was Yutu. It could, this weekend, be Bavi. There is one more recent name worth adding, because it involves Guam directly, and it is fresh. In May of 2023, Typhoon Mawa passed near and over Guam as a powerful storm, delivering the island's most significant typhoon blow in decades, tearing up the power grid and the water system, and forcing yet another long, grinding recovery. So the record of just the past few years alone, Yutu in 2018, Mawa in 2023, tells you that this is not a region that gets a hit once a lifetime. These islands live in the crosshairs. The warm pool that feeds these storms sits right on their doorstep, and every few years it sends another one. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, because it would be easy to take these historical storms and use them to paint the most terrifying picture possible of Bavi, and that would not be honest. Every one of these storms was its own event, with its own exact track, its own timing, its own final strength. Bavi is not any of them. It could weaken before it arrives. It could pass at a distance that spares the worst of the wind. The islands are far better prepared today than they were in Karen's era, with better warnings, better buildings, better emergency systems, and a population that knows exactly how seriously to take a typhoon watch. All of that is real, and all of it works in favour of the people in the path. But the reason I walk you through Karen and Pongsona and Yutu and Marwa is not to predict Bavi's outcome. It is to show you that the ceiling we talked about earlier is not theoretical for these islands. They have touched it. They have had the top of the scale come ashore and take their homes, their power, their normal life, more than once, within living memory and within the last few years. When I tell you the warm pool can turn an ordinary storm into one of the most powerful on the planet, the Marianas do not need to be convinced. They have the photographs, they have the rebuilt homes, they have the family stories. They are, in a sense, a living record of exactly what this ocean is capable of when it decides to spend its stored heat all at once. And that is the thread I want to carry forward out of the past and back into the present. Every one of those historical monsters was, at some point, just a storm over warm water, doing the thing Bavi is doing right now, rapidly intensifying, climbing toward a ceiling the ocean had quietly raised, and each time the island's survival came down, in large part to how much warning they got, and how well they used it. That is the variable that connects Karen to Yutu to Bavi. Not the strength alone, but the race between the strength and the warning. So before we close, I have to deal with two other things. First, the noise, the theories that always swarm a storm like this and try to convince you that someone, somewhere, is doing this on purpose. And second, the honest, sobering truth about why the one thing that could save the most lives, more warning time, is the exact thing that is getting harder to give. Let us clear the noise first, because there is a lot of it this weekend. Part 8. A sky that will not sit still. I have to step back from Bavi for just a moment, because to understand why the theories are swirling the way they are, you need to see the whole sky this weekend, not just the storm. And the whole sky, honestly, is restless in a way that would make anyone with an imagination start connecting dots. While Bavi intensifies over the western Pacific, the eastern half of the United States is baking under a heat dome so strong that a weather balloon launched near Washington measured temperatures in the lower atmosphere that ranked among the highest ever recorded at that site, breaking a daily record by a stunning margin. Hundreds of heat alerts blanket the country. On the same weekend, a burst of energy launched from the sun a few days ago is arriving at Earth, triggering a geomagnetic storm strong enough that the northern lights could be pushed far enough south to be seen from places like New York and Wisconsin. And in that same corner of the western Pacific where Bavi is spinning up, the ground itself has been busy, with the ring of fire producing a cluster of powerful earthquakes in a single day, several of them above magnitude 6 from Indonesia to Taiwan to Japan. So let me say clearly before anyone's mind runs away with it, that these events are not causing each other. The heat dome over America did not summon Bavi. The solar storm did not shake the Earth. The earthquakes did not stir the ocean. These are independent systems, each running on its own physics, that happen to be peaking in the same window of days. If you have watched this channel for any length of time, you know this is a pattern I point out often, because it is real. We do not live on a calm planet with occasional disturbances. We live on a restless one, where the sun, the atmosphere, the ocean, and the ground beneath us are all always doing something, and every so often, by pure chance, they all do something dramatic at once. We covered the heat and the solar storm and the whole convergence in detail in our recent videos this week, so I will not walk through all of it again here, but I bring it up for two reasons. The first is honesty. I do not want you to hear about Bavi in isolation and think the rest of the sky is calm. It is not. This is a genuinely energetic few days across the whole Earth system, and Bavi is the most dangerous piece of it, but it is not the only piece. The second reason is that this exact pile-up, a monster storm and a solar storm and an earthquake swarm all in the same news cycle, is precisely the kind of thing that sends people looking for a hidden hand behind it all. When everything seems to be happening at once, the human mind starts to suspect that someone must be orchestrating it. That instinct is completely understandable, and it is completely wrong, and I want to take it seriously enough to explain why, rather than just laughing it off. Because here is the truth that connects all of this back to the storm. The reason Bavi is intensifying is not hidden in a government facility, or written in the timing of a holiday. It is written in the temperature of the water beneath it, the same warm pool fuel we have been talking about this whole time. The restless sky this weekend is not evidence of a plan. It is evidence of a planet that is, all on its own, more than capable of terrifying us without any help. And the most important of those terrors, the one aimed at real American homes, is the storm doing exactly what the ocean's stored heat permits it to do. So let me take the theories head on, one by one, and show you where each of them breaks against the physics. Part 9. The theories people reach for. The first theory always arrives fastest, and it goes like this. Guam is a major American military base. Therefore, the storm heading for Guam is not an accident. Someone is steering it, or building it, aiming a weapon of weather at a strategic target, using some secret program with a name like the ones you have heard whispered on the internet for years. When I see a storm approach Guam, I can practically set my watch by how quickly this idea appears. I want to treat this seriously, because the instinct behind it is not stupid. It comes from a real place. It comes from the reasonable suspicion that powerful institutions do things in secret, which, historically, they sometimes have. But there is a difference between institutions keeping secrets and institutions being able to build and aim a Category 5 Typhoon, and that difference is measured in an amount of energy that I do not think most people have ever tried to picture. So let us picture it. I told you earlier that a mature tropical cyclone releases heat energy through the condensation of all that rising moisture at a rate hundreds of times greater than the entire electrical generating capacity of the whole world, every power plant on every continent combined, running continuously for days on end. That is not a figure of speech. That is the actual scale of the machine. Now ask yourself honestly, what technology could create that? What device, what facility, what antenna array could conjure hundreds of times the entire planet's power output and pour it into the ocean east of Guam to build a storm? The answer is that nothing humans have ever built comes within a millionth of that scale. We cannot make that much energy appear. We certainly cannot make it appear over a specific patch of ocean and then push the result toward a specific island. The storm is not being powered by a machine, because there is no machine on Earth, not even close, with that kind of power. The storm is being powered by the sun, stored in the ocean over months, which is the only thing anywhere near big enough to do it. What about steering it then? Even if we cannot build the storm, could someone nudge its track toward Guam? Same problem, same physics. The forces that move a storm across the ocean are the large-scale winds of the atmosphere, systems that span thousands of miles and again, carry energy far beyond anything human technology can touch. We cannot move the jet stream. We cannot relocate a subtropical ridge. We can barely, on our best day, coax a little extra rain out of an already raining cloud through cloud seeding, and even that is marginal and hotly debated. Cloud seeding is a garden hose. What you're looking at with Bavi is an ocean. The gap between the two is not a matter of secret technology, it is a matter of physical law. The second theory is more sophisticated, and it is tailor-made for this exact weekend, because of that restless sky I just described. It goes like this. There is a solar storm hitting Earth right now. There is also a typhoon rapidly intensifying. Therefore, the solar storm must be feeding the typhoon. The energy from the sun is powering the storm. It sounds almost plausible, because both involve the sun in some loose way, and both are happening at once. But here is where it falls apart, and it is worth understanding because it is a clean example of how two real things can be completely unrelated. A geomagnetic storm is an interaction between charged particles from the sun and the Earth's magnetic field, high up, in the outer atmosphere and in space. It makes auroras. It can induce currents in power lines and disturb satellites and radio signals. What it does not do, what it physically cannot do, is add meaningful heat to the ocean surface or to the lower atmosphere where storms live. The energy of a geomagnetic storm, for all its beauty in the sky, is trivially small compared to the energy of the ocean's stored heat. It plays in a different arena entirely, up high, with the magnetic field, while the typhoon runs on the warm water far below. The sun does power the typhoon, yes, but it does so the slow way over months by heating the ocean, not the fast way, through this weekend's burst of particles. Same star, two completely different mechanisms on two completely different timescales. This is the same clean line we have drawn before on this channel between space weather and surface weather, and it holds here too. The aurora over New York and the typhoon over Guam are not talking to each other. The third thing people say is not really a conspiracy theory at all, and I want to end on it, because it deserves a different kind of answer. People say the media only cares about storms when they threaten the mainland. When it is Guam, when it is Saipan, nobody covers it. And to that one, I do not have a debunk, I have an agreement. because it is largely true. It is not, in my view, evidence of a coordinated plan to ignore the Pacific. It is something more ordinary and in a way sadder than that. It is the simple gravity of attention, the way coverage flows toward the largest audiences and the most familiar places, and the way small, far-flung communities get left in the margins even when their people are just as American, and their danger just as real. That is not a secret weapon. It is a habit of neglect, and the honest response to it is not to invent a villain, but to refuse to look away, which again is exactly what you're doing right now. I want to say one more thing about why these theories are so magnetic, because I do not think the people who believe them are foolish, and I do not want to talk down to anyone. There is something in all of us that finds a hidden hand less frightening than pure chance. A world where a shadowy program builds and aims storms is strangely a more comfortable world than the real one, because at least it has someone in charge. At least it means the disaster has a reason, a purpose, an author who could, in principle, be caught and stopped. The truth we are actually facing is harder to sit with. It is that no one is steering this. It is that the ocean can build one of the most powerful things on the planet, aim it at your home, and give you barely any warning, and there is no villain to blame and no secret to expose, only physics and heat and bad luck and geography. Conspiracy theories, in a way, are a comfort against a universe that does not care. I understand the pull. I just think we owe ourselves the harder, truer story, because only the true story lets us actually prepare. And preparation is the whole point. If you believe a secret program is steering the storm, then there is nothing to do but rage at the sky. And rage does not board a window, or fill a bathtub, or get a family to a shelter. But if you understand the real story, that a warm ocean is fueling a storm the physics permits, then you also understand exactly what to do about it, and exactly why the early warning matters, and exactly why paying attention this weekend is not helpless. The true story is scarier in one way, because it has no author to stop, but it is more useful in every way that counts, because it is the only version that tells you how to survive. So when you strip away all three theories, you are left with the same thing we started with, and it is scarier than any of the conspiracies, because it is real. No one built Bavi. No one is aiming it. No solar storm is charging it. The ocean is doing this, all by itself, with heat it soaked up from the sun over months, and is now spending in a single violent weekend, and it is doing it fast enough to shrink the warning for every American in its path. That is not a comforting answer. It is a true one, and the truest, hardest part of it is still ahead, because now I have to explain why the single most valuable thing in this entire story, warning time, is the thing our science is having the most trouble giving us. Part 10. The hardest forecast in science. Let me tell you about a quiet triumph and a stubborn failure that live side by side in the world of storm forecasting, because together they explain everything about why Bavi is so dangerous and why the danger is a specifically modern one. The triumph is track forecasting. Over the past few decades, meteorologists have gotten extraordinarily good at predicting where a storm will go. If you look back at how far off the average storm track prediction was in the 1970s or 80s and compare it to today, the improvement is staggering. A 3-day forecast of a storm's position now is more accurate than a 1-day forecast was a generation ago. This is one of the genuine success stories of modern science, the product of better satellites, better computer models, better understanding of the large-scale winds that push storms around. When forecasters tell you a storm is heading for a particular island in 3 days, you should take that very seriously, because that part of the science works remarkably well. The failure, the stubborn one, is intensity. Predicting how strong a storm will get is a fundamentally harder problem than predicting where it will go, and progress on it has been painfully, frustratingly slow. And the reason is exactly the thing we have been talking about this whole video: rapid intensification. Because the factors that decide whether a storm explodes in strength, the precise alignment of wind shear and moisture and internal structure over a fuel supply, are small scale, chaotic, and unfold over hours, in the churning core of the storm where our instruments can barely see. We can watch where a storm is going from space with great confidence. We cannot reliably watch, from space, the exact moment its eye locks in and the engine opens to full throttle. That happens at a scale and a speed that our models still struggle to capture. So think about what that means in practice. We can tell the people of Guam with real confidence that a storm is coming and roughly when. That is the track forecast, and it works. What we cannot tell them with the same confidence is exactly how strong that storm will be when it arrives, because that depends on rapid intensification, and rapid intensification is the thing we're worst at predicting. A storm can be forecast as a strong typhoon, and then, in the final day, find everything it wants and detonate into a Category 5, arriving far worse than the forecast that people prepared for. It has happened again and again in basin after basin over the past decade. The track was right, the intensity was low, and people who did everything they were told, who prepared for the storm they were warned about, met a monster instead. Now, in fairness, the science has not been standing still on this. Forecasters have thrown enormous effort at the intensity problem, precisely because they know how much it costs when they get it wrong. In the Atlantic, specially equipped aircraft, the ones people call hurricane hunters, fly directly into storms to measure their pressure and winds from the inside, feeding real numbers into the models rather than leaving them to guess from satellite pictures. New computer models have been built specifically to try to capture the fine-scale processes inside a storm's core. Forecasters have developed statistical tools that weigh the environmental ingredients, the shear, the moisture, the ocean heat, and estimate the odds that a given storm will undergo rapid intensification in the next day or two. More recently, systems that learn patterns from decades of past storms have been added to the toolkit, looking for the subtle signatures that tend to come before an explosion in strength. Bit by bit, the rapid intensification forecast has gotten better than it used to be. This is a problem the field is attacking with everything it has. But better is not solved, and there is a hard honesty in the difference. Even with all of those tools, predicting the exact moment a storm's eye locks in and its engine opens up, and predicting exactly how far it climbs before something stops it, remains at the ragged edge of what is possible. The processes are too small, too fast, and too sensitive to tiny differences in conditions that we cannot measure perfectly. And in the Western Pacific, where the very strongest storms live, there is an added difficulty. That basin does not have the same routine aircraft reconnaissance that the Atlantic does. Forecasters there lean more heavily on satellites, which see the storm from the outside, from above, and cannot always tell you what is happening in the churning core where the intensification is being decided. So the forecasters watching Bavi are, in a real sense, working with one hand tied, trying to read the intentions of a storm they cannot fly into, over the warmest, most storm-friendly water on the planet. That is why their word choice this morning matters so much. When forecasters who know all of these limitations, who know how easy it is for a storm to overperform, still choose to write the words intensifying rapidly and warn directly of Category 5 strength days in advance, they are not hedging. They are leaning as far forward as the science lets them lean, because they can see enough of what is coming to know that caution here would cost lives. When the professionals are this direct this early, the right response is to believe them, and to act as if the worst case is already on its way. That is the trap Bavi represents. The forecasters are being appropriately aggressive this time. They have seen the warm pool, they have seen the low shear, they have used the word rapid, and they are warning of Category 5 strength directly. That is the system working as well as it can. But even now, even with an aggressive forecast, the exact final strength and the exact timing of the peak carry an uncertainty that no amount of skill can fully erase, because the physics of rapid intensification lives in that hard-to-see, fast-moving core of the storm. The honest position, the one the forecasters themselves hold, is that Bavi could overperform even the alarming numbers already on the table. Now here is the part that turns this from a technical problem into something closer to a warning about the future. I told you earlier that the science suggests rapid intensification is becoming more common as the ocean warms. Sit with what that means alongside what I just told you about forecasting. The one behaviour that our forecasts are worst at predicting is the one behaviour that appears to be on the rise. We are getting better at track, yes, but the thing that steals warning time, the sudden spin-up, is both the hardest thing to forecast and apparently an increasingly frequent thing. The gap between what we can predict and what the ocean can produce is not closing on this particular front. In some ways, it may be widening. And warning time, remember, is the whole game. It is the difference between a prepared island and a caught one. Every hour of accurate warning is now families use to protect themselves. When a storm rapidly intensifies at the last moment, it does not just get stronger, it reaches back through time and shortens the warning that people already acted on. The plan that was adequate for the forecast storm is suddenly inadequate for the real one, and there is no time left to change it. That is the specific modern cruelty of a storm like Bavi. It is not only that the ocean can build a monster, it is that the ocean can build it faster than our best science can tell anyone it is coming. I do not want to leave you feeling that the situation is hopeless, because it is not. Forecasters know all of this, which is exactly why they are leaning aggressive on Bavi rather than waiting for certainty. The whole philosophy of a typhoon watch issued days out is to buy back some of the warning time that rapid intensification threatens to steal, to get people preparing for the worst case before the storm has fully revealed itself. That is the system fighting back against the very problem I have described. And the people of the Marianas, hardened by Karen and Pongsona and Yutu and Mawa, know better than almost anyone on Earth to take that early warning seriously, to prepare for the top of the scale even when the storm has not yet reached it. The best defense against a shrinking warning is a population that starts moving the moment the watch goes up and does not wait to be convinced. So let me walk you through what the next 72 hours actually look like, and what the people in the path and the rest of us watching should be paying attention to. Part 11. The next 72 hours. The watch that went out this morning drew a window, and the window is the frame for everything that happens next. Forecasters said typhoon conditions, sustained winds of 64 knots or greater, are possible within 48 to 72 hours as Bavi approaches, so the clock is roughly 2 to 3 days. That is the runway the people of Guam and the Marianas have to work with, and if you know what to watch for, you can read the storm's intentions in that window almost in real time. The first thing the professionals will be watching is the eye. I told you earlier that the formation of a clear, tight eye is the signature of a storm that has thrown off its brakes and opened its engine. So if satellite images over the next day or two show Bavi's eye becoming sharper, rounder and more symmetrical, that is the visual fingerprint of rapid intensification in progress. A ragged, cloud-filled center means the storm is still struggling with something. A clean, wide-open eye, staring back at the satellite like a hole punched through the clouds, means the engine is running hot and the storm is climbing. The islanders will not need a meteorology degree to read that image. A clear eye pointed at you is the ocean telling you it has made up its mind. The second thing to watch is the pressure. Buried inside every one of these storms is a measure of its power that is, in some ways, more honest than wind speed, and that is the atmospheric pressure at its center. The lower that central pressure drops, the more powerful the storm. When you hear that a storm's pressure is falling fast, that is the language of intensification, the storm pulling itself tighter and stronger. Reconnaissance and satellite estimates track this constantly, and a rapidly falling central pressure over the next couple of days would confirm that Bavi is doing exactly what the warm pool is inviting it to do. The third thing, and the one that matters most for exactly who gets hit and how hard, is the track. This is the part the forecasters are best at, and so it is the part you should trust the most, while still respecting its uncertainty. A shift of even a few dozen miles in Bavi's path can be the difference between a direct strike on a populated island and a close, terrifying, but survivable pass just offshore. Over the next 72 hours, the forecast track will tighten, and the cone of possibilities will narrow, and the people on each island will learn, with increasing confidence, whether they are looking at the core of the storm or its flank. That refinement is the system working. It is worth watching closely, and it is worth trusting over any rumour. Let me also describe what the storm's actual passage will feel like, hour by hour, for the people who end up under its core, because understanding the sequence helps people survive it. It begins deceptively. The winds build slowly at first. The rain comes in bands, heavy, then lighter, then heavy again, and there is a long, tense build-up that can last most of a day. Then the eye wall arrives, and this is the worst of it. The full fury of the storm, hours of screaming wind and horizontal rain and flying debris, the freight train roar that survivors never forget. And then, if the very centre passes directly overhead, something eerie happens. The wind stops. The eye arrives, and with it a strange, bright calm, sometimes even a patch of blue sky overhead, an unsettling stillness in the middle of catastrophe. And this is the moment that kills people who do not understand it, because they think the storm is over. They step outside, they start to move around. And then the eye passes, and the far eye wall hits, and now the wind comes screaming from the opposite direction, just as violent as before, catching anyone who let their guard down in the calm. If you're ever in the eye of one of these storms, the rule is simple and it is life-saving. Do not trust the calm. The second half is coming, and it comes from the other side. That is why the guidance from emergency officials is always to stay sheltered through the entire event, not to emerge at the first sign of quiet. It is why the plan matters more than the courage, why the concrete room and the patience to stay in it are worth more than any last-minute heroics. The people who come through these storms are, overwhelmingly, the ones who prepared early, sheltered fully, and waited out the whole thing, including that treacherous calm in the middle. Everything about surviving a storm like Bavi comes down to respecting it enough to not test it, and to having made your decisions before the sky ever turned. And that brings me to the advice that matters most, both for the people in the path and for all of us watching from a distance. If you are on Guam or in the Marianas, the single most important thing I can say is, do not wait to be convinced. Everything we have talked about today, the rapid intensification, the shrinking warning, the difficulty of forecasting final strength, points to one conclusion. Prepare for the top of the scale now, while the sky is still calm, rather than waiting for the storm to prove how bad it will be. The whole danger of a rapidly intensifying storm is that the proof arrives too late to act on. The families who come through these storms best are the ones who treated the watch, the early warning, as if the worst case were already certain, and got their water and their supplies and their shelter plans settled, while there was still time and calm to do it. The concrete house only saves you if you are already in it. For the rest of us, watching from the mainland or from anywhere else in the world, the advice is different, but it matters too. Get your information from the official forecasters, from the National Weather Service, and the agencies whose entire job is to track these storms with real instruments and real accountability. This is a weekend when the internet will be full of dramatic claims, screenshots stripped of context, and confident predictions from people with no data behind them. A storm like this, colliding with a restless sky, and a holiday and a strategic island, is exactly the kind of event that breeds misinformation faster than the storm itself moves. So anchor yourself to the real sources, and do the one thing that costs nothing and helps more than people realize. Pay attention, talk about it. Make sure the people around you know that a major American community is in the path of the most powerful storm on the planet this weekend, because the attention that these islands are so often denied is something every one of us can choose to give. I want to be clear-eyed about the range of outcomes here, because I promised you honesty, and I intend to keep that promise all the way to the end. It is entirely possible that over the next few days, Bavi's track shifts, or its intensity falls short of the worst-case forecast, and the Marianas take a hard but survivable hit, and the hardened islands ride it out the way they have ridden out storms for generations. That is a real and hopeful possibility, and it is the one I am rooting for with everything I have. It is also possible that Bavi does exactly what the warm pool is inviting it to do, reaches the top of the scale, and delivers a blow that these islands will be recovering from for a very long time. I cannot tell you which of those it will be, because the storm has not decided yet, and the part of the storm that decides is the part our science sees least clearly. But whichever way it goes, the lesson of this storm does not change, and it is bigger than this weekend. Because Bavi is not really an anomaly. It is a demonstration. It is the ocean showing us, in real time, over a small piece of American soil, exactly what a warming sea is capable of, and exactly how little warning it intends to give. And that raises the final question, the one I want to leave you with, the one that reaches past Guam and past this weekend and into the world all of us are going to live in. If the ocean can now build a monster this fast, and if the fuel that lets it do so is only getting deeper and hotter, then what have we actually seen this weekend? A rare and violent accident, or the shape of every summer to come? Let me try to answer that. Part 12. What the ocean is telling us. We began this video with a single word, rapid. I told you at the start that of all the words a forecaster could reach for, that one is the most frightening. And now, having gone all the way down into the water and back, I hope you understand why. Rapid is not a description of a storm's strength. It is a description of a storm's relationship with time. And time, in the end, is the only thing that ever really protects any of us from the sky. Let me pull the whole story back together, because it is a single story, and every piece of it points the same direction. There is a storm called Bavi, east of Guam, being drawn into the most powerful category we have a name for. It is being drawn there rapidly, and the reason it is rapid is not a mystery and not a plot. The reason is beneath it, in the largest reservoir of warm water on the planet, a tank of stored sunshine reaching far below the surface, running hotter than its own recent normal. That warm pool is raising the ceiling on how strong storms are allowed to become, and it is removing the natural break, the cold water below, that usually keeps them in check, and so an ordinary storm over that extraordinary water becomes one of the most powerful things on Earth, and it does so faster than our finest science can predict, over a small piece of American soil where 150,000 of our fellow citizens are standing on the front row on the birthday weekend of the country they belong to. That is the whole story, and notice what is missing from it. There is no villain in it. There is no secret weapon, no engineered target, no solar beam charging the storm from space. There is only the ocean, doing what the physics permits, with heat it borrowed from the sun over months and is now spending in a single violent weekend. And I have come to believe that this is actually the more unsettling version, not the less. A conspiracy, in a strange way, would be comforting, because a conspiracy has an author, and an author can be stopped. What we are actually looking at has no author. It is just the machinery of a warming planet, running exactly as the laws of physics say it must, and it does not care that it is a holiday, and it does not care that the island is small, and it does not care that the people in the path are the ones who so often go unseen. Here is the thought I cannot shake, and I want to hand it to you honestly, because it is the real reason this storm has held my attention over everything else happening in the sky this weekend. For most of human history, the ocean's power was a fixed thing. Terrifying, yes, but bounded. The sea could only ever build a storm as strong as the sea itself was warm, and the sea was as warm as it had always been. What is different now, what is genuinely new in the story of storms, is that we have started to change how much fuel is in the tank. Season by season, we are deepening and warming the reservoir, we are cranking the roof of the stadium upward, and we are doing it in exactly the way that most rewards the rarest, most explosive, hardest to predict storms, the Bavis, the ones that detonate instead of grow. So when I ask whether this weekend is an accident or a preview, the honest answer, the one the science supports, is that it is a little of both, and that the balance is shifting from the first toward the second. Bavi itself is a specific storm, with its own track and its own luck, and it may yet spare the worst. But the conditions that made Bavi possible, the overfull warm pool, the raised ceiling, the rising odds of rapid intensification, those are not a one-weekend accident. Those are the new baseline, and a new baseline is not a headline. It is a direction. It is the shape of the water that every future storm will be born over. I keep coming back to that image of the trade, and I want to leave it with you, because I think it is the truest thing in this whole story. These islands, Guam and Saipan, and Tinian and Rota, are beautiful because of the ocean. The warm, clear turquoise water is the source of their fisheries, their beaches, their whole way of life. It is the reason anyone ever wanted to live there, the reason the islands are green and alive, and that exact same water, this weekend, is the thing that is trying to destroy them. The warm pool gives these islands their life, and when it decides to spend its heat all at once, the power to take it away. There is no separating the two. The sea that sustains them is the sea that threatens them, and the warmer it gets, the sharper that bargain becomes. Every coastal community on a warming planet is going to have to learn to live inside that same trade, but the people of the Marianas are living inside it right now, this weekend, in the dark, listening to the roar. And I think that is the reason this storm, out of all the storms, is worth your attention tonight, even if you live thousands of miles from the nearest ocean. Because what is happening east of Guam is not a distant curiosity. It is a preview, delivered early, to the people who always seem to get the previews first, of a bargain that the whole world is slowly being drawn into. We are all in one way or another, downstream of that warming water. The heat the ocean is storing does not stay politely in one place. It shows up as stronger storms here, as longer heat waves there, as shifting seasons and failing harvests and rising seas somewhere else. The Marianas are simply standing at the front of a line that, over the coming decades a great many of us are going to find ourselves in. When you watch how they face this, you are watching a rehearsal for a future that is coming for far more of the map than a few small islands in the Pacific. I do not say that to frighten you into paralysis, because paralysis helps no one, least of all the people in the path tonight. I say it because attention, real, sustained, clear-eyed attention, is the beginning of everything else. It is the beginning of preparation. It is the beginning of the political will to harden communities and fund the warnings and build back stronger. It is the beginning of aid flowing to a small island the week after the cameras leave. None of that happens without people first deciding to look, and to keep looking, at the parts of the world that the news finds easy to forget. So if this video does nothing else, I hope it makes you one of the people who looked this weekend at a storm and a community that most of the country will never hear a word about. Because in the end, the ocean is not hiding anything from us. It is not plotting. It is not aiming. It is simply telling us, in the plainest language it has, what a warming sea can do, and how fast it can do it, and how little warning it intends to leave. The only question that remains is whether we are willing to listen and to act, before the next monster rises out of the water with even less warning than this one. The sea has been remarkably clear. The rest is up to us. And that, in the end, is the core of what I wanted you to take from all of this. We spend a lot of time, all of us, looking up. We look at the sun, at the storms in the sky, at the auroras, at the asteroids, waiting for the danger to come from above. But the most dangerous thing on Earth this weekend, the most powerful thing on the entire planet right now, did not come from the sky. It rose up out of the water. It was built, quietly, patiently, out of heat the ocean had been saving, and it was unleashed in a matter of hours, faster than anyone could be warned. The threat did not fall on us. It surfaced. So here is the question I will leave you with, and I mean it not as a scare, but as something to actually sit with. Because I think it is the question this whole century is going to keep asking us in one form after another. If the ocean can now take an ordinary storm and turn it into one of the most powerful things on the planet in the space of a single day, and if the water that lets it do that is only getting warmer and deeper with every passing year, then the real question is not how strong the next monster will be. We will find that out. The real question is whether we will ever see it coming in time. Because a warming sea does not just build bigger storms, it builds them faster than we can sound the alarm, and a warning that arrives too late is no warning at all. The people of Guam are watching the water this weekend. Maybe, for once, the rest of us should be watching it with them.